Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alexa Shanks. I am co-chair of the Diversity Project's Working Families workstream. I'm also head of intermediary relations at Mercer and a mother of three. In today's session, we will be discussing the results from the Diversity Project's latest parental leave survey and sharing what we believe is best practice. We'll then move to a panel session, and I'm delighted to be joined by Meghana Toshi from Triple Point, Harj Kaur from LGPS Central, and Heather Inglis from Aberdeen. And they'll be sharing their experiences of introducing enhanced parental leave policies and include the different challenges they face given their firm's unique circumstances and size. But before we begin, I'm conscious that not everyone is going to be familiar with the Diversity Project and the work that we do. So the Diversity Project is a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 2016, and it champions cross-company DEI initiatives. There are over 100 different members, and members of those firms work on work streams such as neurodiversity, social mobility, race and ethnicity, and working families. And the work streams kind of collaboratively work together to achieve their own goals, but also the goals of the Diversity Project. And this year, there's a focus on the new ways of working, so understanding how the pandemic has influenced the ways and the cultures of our organizations, making sure that we incorporate intergenerational views and also allyship. The Working Families Group in particular aims to advocate and promote the needs of working families throughout the life of a working family. So thinking about the needs of a family when a child is born, as a family transitions, their child goes through educations right to the point where some members of the family may actually have caring responsibilities. And our role really is to identify the needs and the best practices for firms within our industry to implement to support those families. Parental leave has been a really important focus for us since we as a group were founded in 2019. And if you look at the research that has been done into the impact of parental leave on the profile of our workforce and actually in society in general, all the findings point to the fact that gender equality will not be achieved unless equal parental leave policies are implemented, and that the motherhood or the childhood penalty is the greatest driver of the gender pay gap. So with this in mind, the Working Families Group have set themselves a goal of 90% of member firms offering what we believe is the gold standard of 26 weeks paid parental leave. We believe that parental leave is the best way to move the needle of the gender pay gap, and also it will help the UK move to a model which has kind of become known as the dual earner, dual carer model, which has been so successful in countries such as kind of Iceland and Sweden. So to track our progress and how we're moving towards this goal, we launched a parental leave survey in 2021. So this is our second year, and I'm delighted to be able to share some of the results with you today. And you'll see the highlights on the screen that Caroline's kindly brought up. So we had responses from 59 firms in 2022, and this was up from 37 last year. So, you know, a relatively small sample size, but really important that kind of like more firms are engaging with this, that they're happy to share their information, some on a confidential basis, some on a non-confidential basis. And whilst we'd like everybody to be disclosing, in full transparency, it's really important to see that there is, pleasing to see that there is increasing transparency. So the most encouraging statistic for me, really, if I look at the survey, is that 31 firms now offer what the workstream classify as the gold standard, so 26 weeks more or more paid maternity leave. And this figure was closer to 20 last year. It's, again, if we look at the fact that we've got over 100 members, we're still some way off 90%, but the direction of travel is certainly in the right way. If we look at paternity leave, there's been some progress, but probably not where we'd like it to be. There are 10 member firms offering 26 weeks paid or more. There are another 32 firms which offer better than the standard, sort of 2 weeks paternity leave, and they're offering between 4 and 20 weeks. So great to see. But if we think back to the fact that the motherhood penalty, so the loss of earnings that a mother suffers when she takes time out of the workforce to raise her children, is the biggest driver of the gender pay gap, then we really know that firms need to make meaningful changes to their paternity leave policies, as it won't happen until fathers are incentivized and able to take time out to care for their children. And the type of leave that fathers are taking is also really important. It should not be to the mother's detriment, and it should be in a similar fashion to the way that maternity leave is structured. Parental leave reinforces the social expectations. So we need to make sure that the expectation going forward is that both parents will take time out of the workforce to care for their children. And we must all realize that the benefits of these changes are not just focused on mothers. Actually, if we look at the research, the benefits of implementing equal parental paid policies will be to the families and the employers and society. And actually, some of the research even goes to the pointing to the fact that, you know, the academics of children will be improved from having both of their parents at home, and also, you know, mental health as well. So, you know, less mothers will suffer postnatal depression, and fathers in some instances. So the benefits are clear. We can see from the survey that the results that we're making progress, but as attendees, I would ask you to review your policies, please. The other area that we looked at in the survey was how bonuses are treated. So I guess this is where the water is a little is more murky, rather, in terms of the way that firms are treating their bonuses. So some are looking to have discretion, others are pro-ratering for time spent in the workforce or out. So we will be monitoring that going forward, and hope to see get greater clarity on the treatment of those bonuses. The final data point that we looked at, which isn't actually shown on the slides, is firms' approaches to caring policies. So, you know, given the aging population, you know, more of the workforce have caring responsibilities. In fact, it's estimated that 1 in 7 carers also is balancing with that, with a full-time role as well. And so we want to understand what firms are doing to support carers. Only 13 firms have policies, but in practice, we know that firms are using their discretion. But again, I would ask you to think about whether you have a carers policy in place and the benefits that it could bring to you. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of our findings. But please, before we move on, I guess I've got kind of 2 calls to action, one of which I've already mentioned. Please review your policy in line, thinking about what we see as gold standards. So 26 weeks paid parental leave, and for parents, regardless of their gender and their route to parenthood. For those of you who have got firms who are there already, congratulations and thank you so much. You are helping us drive the change forward. But I would ask you to look for role models within your organization, either people who've taken leave or line managers have promoted colleagues, and particularly fathers, to take new enhanced leave policies, because we need you to kind of shine a light on the benefits and advocate for the change, and also make sure that people are not only able to take the leave, but feel comfortable in doing so. So that is the survey results. Caroline, we no longer need the slides, thank you. And I will turn to my panel to hear about the policies that they have adopted. So perhaps, Heather, we could start with you, and then we'll take it in turns in terms of just introducing yourself, please, the policy that Aberdeen offers, and what the key drivers for implementing that policy were.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexa, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for having me along today. So my name is Heather. I am the Global Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Aberdeen, and we are a global investment company of about 5,000 colleagues. mostly based in the UK, but we do have offices in about 30 different locations. Although what I'm going to talk today about is our UK policy, so benefits about 80% of our colleagues. We made some changes to our equal parent leave policy in 2018, and some of the drivers behind that were that we had a gender action plan in place, and had done since about 2016. We knew we wanted to make some changes, and for all the really great reasons that Alexa has just gone through, gender equity it was hugely important as part of that. We were doing some research in our in-house research institute into the benefits of women's economic participation in the workplace. And what was coming through very strongly was that parent leave, paternity leave particularly, was the single biggest factor that would shift the women's economic participation in the workplace. Now, that's not to say it was the only one at all, and they found lots of other things that were important, like tax breaks and benefits and paid childcare, etc. But the one that stood out more than anything was paternity leave. We knew from our data that we wanted to specifically focus our interventions on gender at our mid-career population. So we've done a lot of data analysis, and we saw that actually this was an area of concern for us. So not just attracting women into the organisation at that sort of mid-career point, but also helping them to develop through into more senior roles and retain them in the business. And so we wanted to make sure that we were doing something to support working families differently, to break down some of those gender barriers at work. So we thought about it slightly differently, and we worked with colleagues across the business. We spoke to our gender network, our LGBTQ+ network, our employee forum, etc. And we moved from having a policy of our maternity policy at the time was 6 months full pay, 6 months half pay, and our paternity policy was 2 weeks full paid, to our now gender neutral policy, which is that all of our UK colleagues welcoming a child into their family, whether that's through birth or surrogacy or adoption, are entitled to 52 weeks leave with 40 weeks paid leave as their equal parent leave. Now, there's additional paid leave on top of that for anyone who has a premature birth, and there's no need to share the leave. So what we found with shared parental leave was that just wasn't happening at all. So we removed that when we brought this policy in and said there's no need to share the leave. Both parents can fully participate at the early stages of their family's life in a way that suits them. I'll pause there because I think that's probably enough for that question.
That's great. Thank you so much. Harsh, perhaps we could turn to you next, please. If you're on mute.
Afternoon, everybody. So yes, I'm Harjinder Kaur. I'm Head of Human Resources at LGPS Central. So just a little bit of context. We're a asset management business based out in Wolverhampton, West Midlands, for those of you that may have heard of that location. So UK based, just under 100 staff, so quite unique in terms of context and size in comparison to kind of what Heather's described. I joined the organisation about 5 years ago. So when I initially joined, we had very baseline statutory minimum policies, and we looked at amending that, particularly the maternity policy, less the paternity at that stage, and moved to the traditional 39 kind of week period, which was first 6 weeks at full pay, next 13 at kind of half, and then to statutory maternity pay. So our biggest driver in terms of change came about probably the beginning of last year, and we took a few considerations into play at the time. Firstly, one was feedback. So feedback particularly on the maternity returners that came back, who had taken advantage of the minimum kind of policy at the moment. But more importantly, I think from the paternity leavers, we had a couple of paternity leavers who came back and kind of talked to us a little bit about how minimum the policy was in comparison to the industry and their previous employers. And that kind of triggered the driver for reviewing. So we did do a little bit of research around the industry sector. So if you look at kind of asset management industry, professional services, and we took a slightly bigger leap and I suppose a risk in terms of where do we want to be, and some of the considerations that took kind of into play on that were mainly around, as Heather's described, around building more kind of senior women and coming back into the organisation and looking at kind of promotion of those. One was kind of continuity of service and having female returners come back. We did have one or two leavers after the maternity process, so that was a key driver. What do we do to actually make that change that's going to help retain female returners in the business? We also consulted and talked to our employee staff voice group. So we're not huge and we don't have female network, but this is more a broader staff voice group looking at what people's experiences were out there, what previous employers had actually done. And we introduced the policy of the full maternity pay of 6 months full pay and 6 months half, and moving from the normal statutory minimum for the paternity to a 3-month full paid paternity, which was very, very well received in terms of the change. So going from kind of a minimum to a big leap. And some of the considerations, obviously, we talked to our senior management team on were certainly the inclusivity aspect. So making sure that we kind of have a female workforce which was integrated, and we're trying to build this diversity agenda. The second consideration was more around, okay, we're a small organisation, so how do you take into consideration some of the resilience and the capacity and the resourcing when you offer a package that's quite substantially different? And then looking at feedback. So what kind of employer did we want to be? So clearly family oriented, work-life balance, and some of what you described, Alexa, in terms of what's important to staff in terms of retention. So these were kind of the key considerations in terms of, building that leap together. So I think that's quite important. We also looked a little bit around our demographics and our kind of makeup of our workforce, which was changing certainly 5 years into the business last year, and what was important to staff and what would be important to staff as kind of a non-financial benefit piece. So kind of those are the key drivers and where we got to on that journey.
Great, thank you. Regina, perhaps we could now turn to you.
Great, thanks, Alexa. So I'm Againa. I'm a HR business partner at Triple Point. We're a management investment company. So I think I'll talk a little bit about the journey that I've had in my 2 years. I've been at Triple Point for 2 years when I joined. And I think at the beginning, it was Triple Point was going through a massive change. So this all initially started for us, we initially had 3 months maternity and 2 weeks paternity. That's kind of the offering was at the time 2 years ago when I joined. We had some feedback someone who was going on maternity leave saying, Triple Point is growing, but this specific offering isn't changing, we should really look into it. So it was actually, that is when it started with the joint of me being new and kind of being elsewhere where I'd obviously had a different offering, which was much more. So I kind of fed that back to our management team, which they were happy for me to kind of go out there, review it and, put a proposal together on what will be the best for Triple Point. Also take into consideration we are a small organisation. We were at the time 120. Obviously now we're 240 people. So we had to look at the drivers on what would be the purpose and I guess what the need for it. I think change for us was one of the big factors to kind of look into it as well. We were going to hire at that time over 100 staff, and we need to kind of make the offering as attractive as possible, but also support working families, as already been mentioned on the call. And how do we attract those people to come into our organisation? I looked at different, competitors, I guess, other companies that were offering what the offering was. But actually, one of the big things where we reached out, I think Alexa might be one of you or the team, so diversity project, to look into what you recommended as to be the gold standard at the time. We obviously have to weigh that with where we were in our business cycle as well. So we are at the moment, we're offering 24 weeks maternity and 4 weeks paternity. So we felt that felt right at the time. I guess it's something that we probably look to improve and better over time, and get to the why not sometimes go above the standard and not just, I guess, just about make it or just under it. So we are looking to review that as well as we are continuously growing. But I think, in terms of the drivers, for us was just the change at the time, and it was a perfect time to I guess look into it and get everyone on board.
Great, thank you. I guess there is no such thing as a perfect time, but it was a good it was a good time for you.
Yeah, it was a good time for us. Yeah.
So I guess what most people on the line will be interested in terms of is like what particular challenges did you face? I mean, we like you've all covered a range of drivers, but what was the kind of key challenge that you had to overcome? Heather, perhaps we could start with you, because I know you had to use some powers of persuasion, should we say, for the execo. So perhaps you could share some tips.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it wasn't easy. there were definitely some challenges. And we were thinking about this very much as a flagship policy for us. So that is not to say that all of our policies are gold standard, would compare with others in the same way that our parent leave one does. So we spent a lot of time upfront on some of the research. So looking at our own data, understanding, where we were, listening to our people. We did some analysis with an external organization to be able to go in armed with some data about where we were and why this policy would help. And we set it in the context of all of the work that we were doing around gender. And because our executive team and our board were fully behind that, in fact, it's their plan and they approve it every year, and then the exec leadership team drive it. So they knew that this was something that they wanted to do. And so when we brought back the detail of this is what we actually want it to look like, they already knew it was coming, which definitely helped. And we were able to spend a long time with the stakeholders, trying to get them on board and comfortable with how it would work operationally. And to give you an idea, we started looking at this in 2016. So we put that first action plan in place. We knew that this was something we wanted to go after. We didn't actually agree it with them until 2018. So it took us a wee while, and that was okay. And partly that was because we went through a big, massive merger, which definitely impacted, where the attention was in the business. But partly it was also because we needed to make sure that everyone was particularly comfortable. Cost was our biggest objection every time, and so they needed to be comfortable that this was something that we could manage long term, and that they were prepared to bear the cost of. And every single time we spoke about it, we made sure that it was clear that this was an investment in our talent now and for the future. And that was very much how we thought about it. And putting that through the executive leadership team and then for board approval then meant that we had the most senior stakeholders bought in, which helped a lot when it then was rolled out into the organisation.
Thanks, Heather. I mean, data is an interesting point. It's certainly difficult to quantify the benefits, particularly in the kind of cost savings in the retention thing. But I think I was reading a piece of research by PwC which I would recommend lots of you read, which was saying the kind of they estimate that we save up to 260 million per year on recruitment, turnover, onboarding costs. But by launching the survey, I guess that's the point in terms of we need to make sure that we're creating the data points which can help help you sort of overcome these challenges that you've just described. So Harsh, perhaps we could turn to you. I mean, your challenges, I think you kind of mentioned earlier, were mainly around resilience as a small business and the impact that it will have on teams. Perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so I think three key challenges in that respect. One, as you've touched upon, is the organisation size and kind of context, where we're a pretty small organisation. We didn't have a difficult challenge talking and opening the dialogue with our senior team in terms of implementing the policy and agreeing the policy. I think they were very welcoming to the policy in terms of the change. The key considerations were around affordability, and obviously, is it the right point in our journey now to start considering a big leap from the old policy to the new in terms of affordability, and most importantly, as you said, resilience. So because we have quite small teams, you've got an individual clearly taking advantage of the full 6 months, full 12 months, and also a longer paid paternity leave period, in very small teams, that can be felt in terms of resilience. So, I mean, now we'll come on to the key takeaways. I think the most important aspect we took into consideration was clearly the feedback, because we had individuals that come giving us good, valuable feedback, but most importantly, taking a bigger picture outlook rather than just looking short termism. And I think that was the kind of key player for us. It's kind of that added non-financial benefit, which I know there's direct costs involved, but looking at more the long-term benefit of doing this, certainly in terms of kind of continuity, individual satisfaction, and kind of more engagement with staff. So those were the kind of the key challenges for us.
Great, thank you. And Meghana, over to you, please. I mean, I know you, I was delighted to hear when we were chatting before this webinar that you faced less challenges, but given the way you were and your growth phase and your plans for recruitment, but I guess, it would still be useful to hear from you in terms of the barriers.
No, that's right. Thanks, Alexa. I think, for us, we were at a good time. I think when we were trying to make a few other changes, and like you said, we're going for a massive growth. We're looking to hire over 100 people in, as we have now. So I think I guess the executive team, they were very welcoming to making some positive changes. But I think, as Hardy mentioned, I think there were obviously some reluctant in some areas where they were like, how would this affect the teams, or like the smaller teams? At the time, we were much smaller. I think there was some short sight in, how will this affect us now? But actually, using all the kind of the work that we've done, the research, to present it to them, and looking at the growth we were going to have, all this, that should be less and less of issues. So it's more like a short-term change. We for a longer-term gain, we saw it. So they were very welcome. We were quite lucky, actually. Maybe I feel like I should have pushed even more, but it's been a really good start for us. So the less challenges. So we went through pretty smoothly, but Boucher it's not the same for all organisation, depending on their cycle as well.
Great, thank you. So look, there's some questions coming in, but I guess what I really want today's audience to leave with is some tips, essentially, as if you were them and you were looking to implement change, because I think that's what most of the reason why people will be on this call are those people who are advocating for better policies. What advice would you give them? Heather, perhaps we could start with you on that, please.
Well, do it, I guess, it would be my first. But don't do it in isolation, I would say. So, make sure that it's clear why this is the right thing to do. And I think if we had gone to our board and our exec team and said, so we want to put this policy in place, without having done some of the work beforehand to help them understand what we needed to shift in terms of the diversity and equity and inclusion in our organisation, I'm not sure that it would have landed as well. So it needs to be part of, there has to be a sort of reason behind it, and they've got to kind of understand that. So I definitely wouldn't do it in isolation. And I think you mentioned earlier, Alexa, find your role models and your spokespeople for this. So what we found really worked for us was after we had the policy in place for a year. So we put the policy in place just at the end of 2018, start of 2019. And after we'd had a year of it in place, we went back to find some people who had taken leave. And we made a little video of them with their families talking about the impact that it had had on them. And we found people in all parts of the business, in all different kinds of roles, so front office roles and back office roles, and senior people. And we did a really engaging, lovely video with them to talk about why this was so important and why it had been life-changing for a lot of them. And I think that definitely has helped. And from every year since then, we've seen more and more people take up the opportunity to have that leave, or to increase the amount of leave that they are taking. We see more men than women take parent leave, which probably is to do with the fact that we have slightly more men than women in the organisation anyway, but it's still good to see that there's a higher proportion of men that take it than women. And we've still got some work to do around more of that, role modelling and trying to showcase some of the benefits of this, to try and break down what I think is still some stigma in the organisation. So we still see, for example, women take far more leave than men do. And we have a really flexible policy where you can actually take your leave in 2 blocks. And what we see is that women generally will take a period of like traditional maternity leave where they're off for the full year, whereas men will take 2 blocks of leave, but much shorter lengths of time. So although the offering is exactly the same for both of them, men are still taking slightly less. So there's still a bit of work to do around some of that stigma and role modelling, I think.
Yeah, and that's really interesting in terms of just, I guess, that kind of point sort of reinforces the social expectation, and that was kind of my point in terms of, well, I think you've all alluded to the fact that shared parental leave probably hasn't had the desired effect, because we need to really think about the fact that any enhancements we shouldn't rob Peter to pay Paul. It cannot be to the detriment of the mothers. It must be to make sure that the entire working family benefits from these types of policies. So Harsh, perhaps we could turn to you, please, because particularly just focusing on any smaller firms out there in terms of what advice you'd give to them, particularly on the resilience point, and how you kind of think about cover and role models.
So I think really 3 key takeaways for us. Certainly think about medium to long term, not a short termism approach, and it's sometimes very difficult to measure. And I think one of the questions that come up is around measuring. How do you measure female retention? It's in the chat box. How do you see kind of some of the benefits that come out of this? So in smaller organisations, you're certainly only going to get a small percentage of take up on this, because obviously small number of staff. So keep an eye on kind of feedback, as Heather has said, learn from that. Take, if an individual has a really good story to tell, make sure that kind of role modelled in the right way. But medium term to long term approach rather than very short termism is important. Think about some of the benefits side of this in terms of non-financial benefits. I know it's a cost that we need to pay out, but the engagement and the satisfaction and the feedback you get from staff taking advantage or having the ability to take advantage from the policy is next to nothing. Really, really good feedback in terms of kind of the actual policy, and any staff who might want to take up the policy coming forward. So certainly we've had a couple of staff come up and said, oh, looks as if I'm going to be taking advantage of that next year. So it's really interesting to hear the actual positivity that kind of relates to that. And the third one for me is certainly a learning experience. I think we took a bigger leap from the old to the new. And it was a bit of a drastic change, but not to be afraid of doing that, particularly looking at your industry and sector. So I think those are probably the kind of 3 key takeaways and the learning for us, and kind of guidance to anybody out there.
I think just Jane, just before we pass on to you, there's been a question which is kind of, how do you measure the effectiveness of change? And I think, I think what we're all saying is the data points aren't necessarily quite there. If you look at, the research, there isn't a huge amount of history in terms of parental leave take up, and much more of the effectiveness or the feedback on that is kind of qualitative, like employee engagement and retention, rather than being able to kind of quantify the financials. I don't know, Harsh, if you'd agree with that.
Yes, I think it's more the the engagement you get. I mean, it's things like Net Promoter Score. Would you recommend the organisation to your friends and family because it gives you a great workplace to work in, and you're kind of really happy there. You're able to retain. Retention's a key kind of measure that you would pick up, but clearly that's sometimes very difficult to measure in the short term. It's kind of long term. One of the things I did forget to mention is that clearly one of the considerations that we picked up is this clawback on some of the policies that can be put into place, particularly around maternity and paternity. And one of the considerations we took is you can't kind of give through one hand and then take through the other. So we took our clawback away. So individuals do take advantage of the kind of 12-month maternity the pay that we've got, but without the clawback, which was quite welcoming. I mean, and we're not expecting people to kind of take the maternity leave and then disappear, but it was quite welcoming not to have kind of that tie in, and that releases some of the stress and the pressure from staff.
Great, thank you. And we're going to over to you, please, in terms of your tips and advice.
Okay, thanks, Alexa. I think for us, what I would say, I mean, Harji's kind of already touched on it as well, just don't be afraid, I guess, make meaningful change. And I think for us, we obviously went for the 24 weeks, but, why not go more than that, go above, I guess, the standard. But I also think as well, when we're obviously offering people to, the longer maternity, paternity leave, I mean, we've put some other support in place to support that as well. So because some people may choose to now, because they could afford to do that, may choose to be away on maternity leave, or whatever that is, longer. So how do we support parents when they come back into work or go for that longer period? So we've also put parental coaching in place for paternity and maternity, to support people through that transition, because it could be longer and it can be quite daunting coming back to work when you've been away for a year or whatever that may be. So we've also looked at other factors, which I think is worth considering when you're putting this in place, or you're increasing the offering that you have. So that's probably the advice that I would give, and what we've done as well, which has really helped parents at Trigger Point.
Yeah, I think that's you make a great point. I mean, last year for 2022, pre-leave was a huge focus for working families, and I know that if I think back to when I had my first child, that definitely would have helped. And also things like kind of encouraging the use of keeping in touch days and things like that, just to keep your skin in the game and keep confidence high. So look, thank you all so much for sharing your insights. Perhaps we've got time for a few questions which I may ask. So I guess we've touched on data, but and some kind of research which we can share. Aside from the diversity project, aside from Aberdeen's great research, PwC's research, should also mention How Do You Do It, which is an organisation that's represented on our work stream. They've done some great stuff. Is there any other data points or resources that you guys would recommend to firms, please?
So I would recommend, I guess they're brilliant external research points and are important as you're building your case, but look at your own data as well. So look at, who is leaving, whether they're returning from mat leave, and whether they are still retained a year after they've come back. And so delve deep into your own data, I guess, as well, as much as you can, because if the more you can build up a picture of what's happening, the better. And don't just rely on qualitative stuff, or quantitative stuff, do the qualitative research as well. We did a lot of research with our women in that sort of mid-career population, and you know, our equal parent leave was not the only thing that we put in place. It's one part of a very big, complicated jigsaw of things that will help. But it was definitely something that we felt that the sort of benefit of equalising the burden of the sort of parent burden that the majority of mothers were coming up against was the most important thing.
Great, thank you. Haj, were you going to add?
I was just about to say, I sort of echo what Heather has said, but I think it's very important. I know we've touched on taking feedback from returners. It's also just as important to take feedback from staff in terms of pulse surveys on what they'd like to see, what's important to them. And I think that's planning ahead. I think that's quite critical, and we have been doing a lot of that. I know it's very difficult to always implement everything that, you know, staff want, but it keeps things on the radar. I think that's probably quite important. So think ahead, forward thinking around kind of your benefits package, and certainly around some of your policies.
Great, thank you. And one last question, given we've just got a couple of minutes, but the question was actually directed at Heather, but Haj, we've discussed this before, and I guess throughout all of this, we've kind of reinforced the link between equal parental leave policies and the gender pay gap. Haj, I know you kind of mentioned that you have seen a kind of 4% drop in your gender pay gap, but is anybody able to point to, like Heather, is there experience at Aberdeen? Is that the same, or is it too early to see the impact?
Yeah, so we have seen an impact. It's very difficult to quantify that it is just down to the policy changes that we've made, because as I say, it's one part of a really complicated jigsaw of things that we've put in place. But we have seen improvement. So we've seen a reduction in our gender pay gap for the last 5 years. We have seen we are achieving our gender targets that we put in place for board and senior leadership representation of women, and we have the highest number of female fund managers in firms of our size. So the metrics are looking really good. Whether I could say that it's just down to the policy, I don't know, but we do see coming through our, I guess another data point is through our employee engagement surveys. It's something that is frequently brought up, and even though that policy's been in place since 2019, it is still mentioned by colleagues every year when we do the employee engagement stuff.
I think it's important to say you can't, as you say, Heather, you can't attribute your change or fluctuating gender pay gap directly to kind of policy changes. It's difficult to kind of make that direct link. It's usually a collection of initiatives that you put into place. I mean, the policies that we've put into place only came into effect last year, so it can't have had a direct impact on the gender pay gap directly. But I think it's important to make sure that's part of a wider diversity and inclusion agenda rather than just attributed to kind of policy change. Just to make note of that.
Great. Well, I can't believe it. In all the prep sessions, we have been hugely over time, but we have managed to cover everything. And I hope everybody on the webinar has found this useful and insightful. As I said, please do not hesitate to reach out to either myself or the Diversity Project if you need any other questions answering or have any advice. I would just like to thank my fantastic panel for their participation today and all your hard work in preparing for today. And also, well, the Working Families Workstream, and particularly Kirsty Beasley, who put so much time into collating the data for our annual survey. There will be another iteration of the results out probably towards the back end of this year, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But otherwise, have a good afternoon, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.